3 years ago, I handed a billionaire his ring back. I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to. Not the diamond, though Lord, the diamond. I'm talking about the man, the yes that came with him, the forever. The kind of life my grandmother scrubbed other people's floors, praying I might one day touch with the tips of my fingers. I held all of that in a little velvet box, and I gave it back. People told me I was a fool. My own auntie didn't speak to me for a whole month. There were nights I lay in my apartment, the rent past due, the air conditioner rattling like it was trying to give up, and I asked myself the same thing everybody else was asking. Amani, what is wrong with you? What kind of woman walks away from that? I believed I'd made a mistake. I really did. Right up until the afternoon, I sat on my dying grandmother's bedroom floor with a 60-year-old piece of paper shaking in my hands, and I learned exactly who that man's family was, who they had always been, what they had taken, and from whom. That was the day the floor fell out of my whole life. So let me tell you the story properly from the beginning, because the easy version, the version where he's a villain and I'm a saint and I saw it coming all along, that version is a lie, and I'm too tired and too grateful to lie to you tonight. My grandmother raised me. Her name was Ruth, and if you ever met her, you'd know within 30 seconds exactly where I get my mouth from. My mama passed when I was 6. I don't have a lot of her, just a perfume I can't find anymore and the shape of a song she used to hum. After that, it was me and Grandma Ruth in a little house that always smelled like cornbread and pine sol, and she made sure I understood 2 things before I understood anything else. The first was that I was somebody, not somebody's daughter, not somebody's helper, not somebody's pretty face, somebody. Whole, by myself, with the lights off and nobody watching. The second thing she said so many times it lives in my body like a heartbeat. She'd be standing at that stove with her back to me, and she'd say it almost to herself. Baby, never let nobody build you a house you can't leave. I thought she was talking about men. I thought it was a warning about getting trapped by some smooth-talking somebody who'd pay my bills and own my whole soul in exchange. And it was that, but I would not understand the whole of what she meant for 30 more years, and by then she'd be too sick to hear me tell her she was right. I became an architect. Don't ask me where that came from in a house with no money. I think it was because building things was the one kind of power nobody could give me or take from me. You draw a line on a page, and one day people walk through it. They live inside your idea. That felt like the closest thing to magic I was ever going to get. By the time you meet me in this story, I was 31 and I had my own firm. And when I say firm, I want you to picture it honestly. It was me and a young man named Desmond who I could barely pay, and a leased printer that jammed if you looked at it sideways, and a name on the door, Whitfield Design. My name, my grandmother's name. That door was the proudest thing I owned, and most months it was the only thing I owned, because that bank account was a desert. But it was mine. Every brick, every late night, every contract I fought for in rooms where people assumed I was there to bring the coffee. Mine. I didn't have money. I had myself, and I had decided a long time ago that myself was enough. I met Julian Hale on a Tuesday in a glass conference room 22 floors above a city that had never once made room for me. My firm had been invited to pitch on a small community center project. Small money, but the kind of work I loved, a building meant for people, not for profit. I'd stayed up 3 nights getting the drawings right, and when I walked in to present, I noticed there was a man at the end of the cable who didn't belong with the rest of them. The others were mid-level. He was still. Powerful people get this stillness. Have you noticed that? They never have to perform their importance. The room performs it for them. That was Julian. He ran Hale Development, which I would later learn was one of the largest real estate empires in the entire country, the kind of company whose name is on skylines you've stood under your whole life without ever once wondering who put it there. I didn't know any of that yet. I just knew he was watching me like my drawings were the most interesting thing he'd seen all week. Here's the part I have to be honest about, because it matters for everything that comes after. He didn't talk down to me. I had braced for it. I always braced for it. But when I finished, he didn't ask me the question they always ask, can your little firm even handle this? He asked me why I'd pulled the windows down low to the ground, and I told him the truth, that I'd grown up in a house where the windows started above a child's eye line, so a kid like me never got to see out, only up, and I had promised myself that any building I made for regular people would let a child see the world without standing on a chair. The room went quiet, and Julian Hale looked at me, and he said, "That's the best answer anyone's given me in a year." He chose my firm, not out of charity. I need you to hear that, because I needed to hear it then. He chose it because the work was good. I had earned that seat. I let myself believe it. I had earned it. I told myself it was just business. I was lying. I'm not going to pretend the next part was complicated because falling in love is the simplest thing in the world while it's happening. It only gets complicated later when you have to explain it. It started with work, and then it stopped pretending to be work. Dinners that ran past midnight, phone calls where neither of us would hang up first, just breathing on the line like teenagers. He flew me out to see buildings I had only ever studied in books, stood me in front of a cathedral in the rain and watched my face instead of the architecture, like I was the thing worth the trip. And I want to tell you something that's going to be hard to hold next to how this ends. He was kind. He was genuinely bone-deep kind to me. There was a dinner with investors, a whole table of men who looked at me like a coat check girl who'd wandered into the wrong room, and one of them made a comment. You know the kind dressed up as a compliment so you can't object without looking sensitive. And before I could even decide whether to swallow it, Julian set his glass down and said, "Cold as January. Whitfield Design is the only reason this project will be worth a damn. I'd choose my words about her very carefully." The whole table went still. Nobody had ever stood in front of me like that. Nobody with that much to lose. So when people ask me, and they do, they still do, was it real? I tell them yes, it was real. That's what made it so hard. If he had been a monster, I could have run and called myself smart. He wasn't a monster. He was a good man with a good heart, and that is exactly the kind of thing that can cost you your whole self before you ever notice the bill coming due. The first crack was so small I almost feel silly telling you about it. Hale Development had a public relations team, of course they did, and as Julian and I became more and more known, they started managing me, gently, lovingly even. They rewrote my bio for an event and softened it, took out the part about the rattling air conditioner and the leased printer, made my whole self-made struggle sound like a charming hobby I'd grown out of. I noticed. I let it go. Then there was the gala where his mother introduced me. She had a voice like cool silk, and she touched my elbow and said to a circle of glittering people, "And this is Julian's designer friend." Designer friend, like I drew his curtains. I smiled. I let that go too. But here's the one that should have stopped me cold and didn't. My Ferns projects, the ones we did with Hale, kept quietly getting folded in, that's the phrase they used, folded into the Hale portfolio. My name on the plaque got smaller, then it became in partnership with. Then on one building I had bled over for 8 months, my name wasn't anywhere at all, just the Hale crest gleaming. When I asked, they smiled and said it was simpler this way, more cohesive, better for the brand. And I told myself they were right, because the alternative was admitting that the woman who built herself from nothing was slowly, politely being erased into someone's brand. There was one more sign, and it's the one I think about most. I brought Julian to meet my grandmother. Grandma Ruth was old by then, slow in her body but sharp as a blade everywhere it counted. She made him a plate. She was polite. She was always polite. That generation could be so polite it felt like weather. She asked him about himself, and he answered, charming, warm, telling her about the company, about his grandfather Augustus, who'd built it all from nothing back in the day. And I watched my grandmother's face do something I had never seen it do. She went quiet. Not shy quiet, listening quiet. The way you go quiet when you hear a sound in the house at night and you're trying to place it. After he left, I was washing the dishes, all lit up, ready for her to tell me how handsome he was, how well-spoken, and she dried a plate slow, and without looking at me, she said, "Where'd you say his people made their money?" I laughed. I said, "Grandma, real estate, the man builds buildings. What's wrong with that?" She didn't answer. She just kept drying that plate long after it was dry. I brushed it off. God forgive me, I brushed my grandmother off. I thought she was being a suspicious old woman who didn't trust money she hadn't seen earned. I had no idea that she was standing in her kitchen 60 years from her own childhood, hearing a name she had spent a lifetime trying to forget. He proposed on a rooftop he'd had emptied just for us. And it was beautiful. I'm not going to take that away from him or from me. He got down on one knee, this man who never had to ask anyone for anything, and his hands were shaking, and he told me I was the first true thing in a life full of expensive things. He opened the box. The ring caught the city lights and threw them back, and for one long minute I forgot every single warning I had ever been given, including the ones from my own blood. I said yes. I want you to know that. I said yes, and I meant it, but the life came attached to conditions, and the cruelest thing about them was that they were never spoken as conditions. They were offered as gifts. That's how a gilded cage works. Nobody ever shows you the bars. They show you the view. Whitfield Design would be brought under the Hale umbrella. My name would come off the door, for efficiency, for protection, for tax reasons that sounded so reasonable. I would become the face of the Hale Foundation, their philanthropy, their charitable heart. I would step back from building under my own name because, and he said this with so much love it broke me, "You don't have to fight for scraps anymore, Imani. You're a Hale now. You're home." The first crack was so small I almost feel silly telling you about it. Hale Development had a public relations team, of course they did, and as Julian and I became more and more known, they started managing me, gently, lovingly even. They rewrote my bio for an event and softened it, took out the part about the rattling air conditioner and the leased printer, made my whole self-made struggle sound like a charming hobby I'd grown out of. I noticed. I let it go. Then there was the gala where his mother introduced me. She had a voice like cool silk, and she touched my elbow and said to a circle of glittering people, "And this is Julian's designer friend." Designer friend, like I drew his curtains. I smiled. I let that go too. But here's the one that should have stopped me cold and didn't. My Ferns projects, the ones we did with Hale, kept quietly getting folded in, that's the phrase they used, folded into the Hale portfolio. My name on the plaque got smaller, then it became in partnership with. Then on one building I had bled over for 8 months, my name wasn't anywhere at all, just the Hale crest gleaming. When I asked, they smiled and said it was simpler this way, more cohesive, better for the brand. And I told myself they were right, because the alternative was admitting that the woman who built herself from nothing was slowly, politely being erased into someone's brand. There was one more sign, and it's the one I think about most. I brought Julian to meet my grandmother. Grandma Ruth was old by then, slow in her body but sharp as a blade everywhere it counted. She made him a plate. She was polite. She was always polite. That generation could be so polite it felt like weather. She asked him about himself, and he answered, charming, warm, telling her about the company, about his grandfather Augustus, who'd built it all from nothing back in the day. And I watched my grandmother's face do something I had never seen it do. She went quiet. Not shy quiet, listening quiet. The way you go quiet when you hear a sound in the house at night and you're trying to place it. After he left, I was washing the dishes, all lit up, ready for her to tell me how handsome he was, how well-spoken, and she dried a plate slow, and without looking at me, she said, "Where'd you say his people made their money?" I laughed. I said, "Grandma, real estate, the man builds buildings. What's wrong with that?" She didn't answer. She just kept drying that plate long after it was dry. I brushed it off. God forgive me, I brushed my grandmother off. I thought she was being a suspicious old woman who didn't trust money she hadn't seen earned. I had no idea that she was standing in her kitchen 60 years from her own childhood, hearing a name she had spent a lifetime trying to forget. He proposed on a rooftop he'd had emptied just for us. And it was beautiful. I'm not going to take that away from him or from me. He got down on one knee, this man who never had to ask anyone for anything, and his hands were shaking, and he told me I was the first true thing in a life full of expensive things. He opened the box. The ring caught the city lights and threw them back, and for one long minute I forgot every single warning I had ever been given, including the ones from my own blood. I said yes. I want you to know that. I said yes, and I meant it, but the life came attached to conditions, and the cruelest thing about them was that they were never spoken as conditions. They were offered as gifts. That's how a gilded cage works. Nobody ever shows you the bars. They show you the view. Whitfield Design would be brought under the Hale umbrella. My name would come off the door, for efficiency, for protection, for tax reasons that sounded so reasonable. I would become the face of the Hale Foundation, their philanthropy, their charitable heart. I would step back from building under my own name because, and he said this with so much love it broke me, "You don't have to fight for scraps anymore, Imani. You're a Hale now. You're home." And that's when I heard her, plain as if she were standing in the room, my grandmother's voice, the stove, her back to me. "Never let nobody build you a house you can't leave." I just didn't know yet how literal that warning was about to become. I want to tell you the truth about the weeks that followed, because if I make my choice sound easy, then I'm lying to you again, and I'm done lying. It was not easy. I lay awake doing the math of it. On one side, never worrying about money again. Not for me, not for my grandmother, not for any child I might one day have. Security so total, it's hard for a woman who grew up the way I grew up to even imagine it, like trying to imagine a color you've never seen. And love, real love from a man who would have walked through fire for me. On the other side, nothing you could put in a bank, just me. Just the woman in the mirror who had a name on a door. I almost said yes for real. I need you to know how close I came, because if you've ever been offered everything in exchange for just a little piece of yourself, just the part nobody would miss, just the name, just the door, then you know it doesn't feel like a deal with the devil. It feels like being loved. It feels like finally being safe. What decided me wasn't anger, it was a picture in my head I couldn't get rid of. I imagined a building I'd designed 20 years on, and I imagined a little black girl, some little girl like I had been, the kind who never got to see out the window, walking up to it and looking at it the way I used to look up to things too big for me. And I imagined her turning to her mama and asking the only question that's ever mattered to me: who made this? And in the life Julian was offering me, the answer would not be a name. It would be a foundation, a crest, an empire. It would be anyone but me. I would have spent forever building beautiful things, and not one of them would have been able to say my grandmother's name. So I gave the ring back. It was not a screaming match. I almost wish it had been. Rage is so much easier to survive than tenderness. We both cried. He held the box in his hand like he didn't understand what it was anymore, and he kept doing the thing that finally told me everything. He kept offering me more freedom inside the cage, a bigger title. We could keep the door, the name, some version of it. He kept raising the price like the problem was that the number wasn't high enough. And I realized, standing there, loving him with my whole chest, that he genuinely could not see it. He thought I was leaving because it wasn't enough. He never once understood that I was leaving because it was too much. Too much of him, of the empire, of the gravity of all that money, and not enough room left over for the woman I had spent my whole life becoming. "I'm not walking away from you," I told him. "I'm walking back toward me." He didn't understand that either. Why would he? Nobody had ever asked Julian Hale to choose between being loved and being himself. The world had simply handed him both at birth, along with everything else. Now, here is where most stories would end. The strong woman walks away, head high, music swells, and we all clap. But life doesn't roll credits. Life sends you the bill. The months after were brutal. The bank account stayed a desert. The phone, which used to ring with Hale-sized opportunities, went quiet. Turns out a lot of those open doors had Julian's hand on them all along, and when I walked away, they shut so soft I almost didn't hear them. My auntie's silence, the cousins who suddenly had opinions, the well-meaning friend who said, "You know you're not getting any younger," like I'd turned down a man over a parking spot. And the doubt. Oh, the doubt was the worst of it. 3 a.m, AC rattling, asking the ceiling whether I'd thrown away the only good thing that was ever going to happen to me. Whether myself was even worth all this struggling, scrappy, name-on-a-door self that couldn't pay its own light bill. I want to be honest, I did not feel like a woman who'd won anything. I felt like a woman who'd set fire to her own house to prove she didn't need a roof. That's where I was, broke, doubting, half convinced I'd ruined my life, when my grandmother started dying. She'd been slipping for a while, but that last stretch came fast, the way it does. I moved back into the little house that smelled like cornbread and pine sol, and I sat with her, and I fed her, and I held her hand through nights so long they felt like they had no morning on the other side. And one afternoon, when she had more strength than she'd had in days, they get that sometimes near the end, a last clear afternoon, she told me to go into her closet and bring down the shoebox from the top shelf, the old one in the back, behind the church hats. I'd seen that box my whole life and never once opened it. You don't in our family. There are boxes you leave alone. I brought it to the bed. She made me open it. Inside, there were papers. Old papers, soft and yellow as autumn, folded so many times the creases had gone furry. There was a photograph, a real photograph, black and white, scalloped edges, of a street I had never seen. A beautiful street, tidy houses with porches, a storefront with a hand-painted sign, children on bicycles. Black faces, all of them, dressed in their Sunday best, looking into the camera like they owned the whole wide world and knew it. "That's home," my grandmother said. Her voice had gone somewhere far away. "That's where I come up before." "Before what, Grandma?" She put her finger on one of the papers. Her hand was shaking, but she put it right where she wanted it, and she said, "Before they took it." The papers were deeds. property deeds in my family's name, names I half recognized from the family Bible, great-greats I'd only ever heard about in stories. And the neighborhood had a name printed right there at the top of every page, the Callaway District. I had never heard of it. There was a reason for that. There was a whole machine of reasons for that. The other papers told the rest. An eviction notice, a notice of acquisition, language so cold and polite it could have come straight from the men who'd rewritten my bio. Urban renewal, blight, the public interest. In the 1960s, the city decided the Callaway District, a thriving, paid-for, black-owned neighborhood, the place in that photograph, the place with the children on bicycles, was blighted. And they cleared it, bought it for pennies on the dollar from people who had no power to say no, and the ones who wouldn't sell, they took anyway. Scattered an entire community to the wind, bulldozed the porches, paved over the church. My grandmother's family home, the street where she learned to ride a bike, gone before she was grown. And she had carried that box up to the top shelf of every closet in every house she ever lived in for 60 years, and never spoke its name, not once, not to me. I was crying, holding these papers, this woman's whole stolen childhood in my two hands, and I asked her, I don't even know why I asked, maybe my own hands already knew. I said, Grandma, who took it?
She said.
Who did this?
I found the name on the acquisition order, the company that had done the buying. The first big deal, the one that turned a small-time operator into something enormous, the founding acquisition of an empire that would one day put its crest on skylines all over this country. Hale. Augustus Hale. The grandfather. The one Julian had told my grandmother about over a plate of food in her own kitchen. Built it all from nothing back in the day. From nothing? It wasn't nothing. It was the Callaway District. It was that street. It was those children on bicycles. It was my grandmother's front porch, the Hale fortune, the empire I had almost been folded into, the umbrella I had almost let swallow my name. Its very first brick was laid on top of my own family's home, after they'd been thrown off it for pennies and told it was for the public good. The man I had loved, the man whose ring I held on a rooftop, he was the heir to the thing that destroyed us. And his gift, the security, the foundation, the "you're home now, you don't have to fight for scraps anymore." I understood, sitting on that floor with the deed shaking in my hands, what it really was. It was my own stolen inheritance, handed back to me as charity, with his name on it instead of mine. I'm going to tell you what went through me, and I need you not to look away from it, because it's the truest thing in this whole story. I had spent months believing I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. I cried into my pillow asking myself what kind of fool walks away from everything. And in one single afternoon, I understood. I had not walked away from anything. I had been pulled. Every grandmother and great-grandmother and great-great who had ever been dragged off that land, every porch that ever got bulldozed, every child in that photograph who grew up scattered, they had been standing behind me the whole time with their hands on my back, pulling me away from a door I was never, ever supposed to walk through. My grandmother's warning wasn't about men. It was never just about men. Never let nobody build you a house you can't leave. She knew. She had watched a house get taken from people who couldn't leave it in time, and she had spent my whole childhood trying to make sure her granddaughter would have the one thing her own people were robbed of, the power to walk out of any house on her own 2 feet with her own name still in her mouth. I almost gave that away on a rooftop, for love. For safety, for a view. Let me tell you what I believe about Julian, because I've had 3 years to think about it, and I owe you the fair version. I don't think he knew. I really don't. I don't think he ever sat down and learned the name of the neighborhood his great fortune was built on. Why would he? That's not a story empires tell themselves. They say built from nothing back in the day. They put the founder's portrait on the wall and they teach you to admire the genius, and they very carefully never ever say what the nothing used to be or who was living on it. And I came to understand that this is the deeper horror of the whole thing. Not a mustache-twirling villain who knew exactly what he had. Something worse. A genuinely good man who had inherited a crime so completely that it didn't even register as a crime anymore. It had been laundered across 3 generations into a legacy, into philanthropy, into a foundation that hands money to communities like the one his grandfather destroyed and calls it generosity. He wasn't lying to me when he said, "You're home now." He believed it. That's how thorough the forgetting had to be.
So, no, I didn't go running back to confront him, and I didn't go running back to forgive him either, and I want to be clear about that, because there's always somebody waiting to tell a Black woman the noble thing to do is forgive. I didn't owe him my forgiveness. I didn't owe the empire my closure. But I'll tell you what I did do. I got up off that floor. I had something now that I'd never had before. I had the papers. I had the photograph. I had a name, Calloway, that the city had spent 60 years making sure nobody remembered. And, in the strangest gift of all, I had attention. See, when you publicly hand a billionaire his ring back, people talk. The breakup that I thought ruined my reputation turned out to have put a microphone in front of my face, and I'd spent months too heartbroken to know what to say into it. Now I knew. I am an architect. Building things is the one power nobody could ever give me or take from me. You draw a line on a page, and one day people walk through your idea. So I decided to draw the line that mattered most. I went to work on the Calloway district, not to rebuild it. You can't rebuild a thing like that. Those children on bicycles are gone. That porch is under a parking structure now, and it's staying there. But I went to work to make it seen. I dug up the records, the ones they'd hoped were dust by now. I found the descendants, the other scattered families, the grandsons and granddaughters of those Sunday best faces in the photograph, and I learned we had all been carrying our own shoeboxes on our own top shelves, never saying the name. We started something, a land trust, so that what little could be reclaimed could never be folded into anybody's portfolio ever again. A memorial on the one corner we could fight our way back to, a real one with the names, and a building, a community building, designed by me, owned by no empire, with windows that come down low to the ground so a child can see out. And on the cornerstone of that building I had them carve a name. Not mine, hers, Ruth. My grandmother lived long enough to see the drawing. She didn't live to see it built. That took years, and she only had that last clear stretch of afternoons. But I brought the drawing to her bed, and I unrolled it across the quilt, and I put my finger on the cornerstone where the carving would go, and I read her name out loud to her. And my grandmother, who had carried the Calloway district up to the top shelf of every closet for 60 years and never once let it out, who had stood in her own kitchen and gone afraid for the first and only time I ever saw it, my grandmother put her shaking hand over mine on that drawing, and she said, "You left in time." That's all. You left in time. She knew what she was saying. She was the only person on this earth who fully understood that I hadn't thrown my life away on a rooftop. I had saved it. She had spent my whole childhood teaching me how, in the only language she had, never knowing she'd be alive to see me actually do it. She passed not long after. The deed is back in our family's hands now. It doesn't get us the land back, it gets us the truth back, which it turns out is the only inheritance they could never quite finish stealing. So, people still ask me if I regret it, if I lie awake thinking about the rooftop, the ring, the forever, the man, and I tell them the truth. A billionaire offered me a life, And it was a beautiful life, and the love in it was real, and I'm not going to insult you or myself by pretending otherwise. But it was a house built on the bones of my own people. And I would have spent the rest of my days decorating it, hanging pictures on the walls, making it warm, living, smiling, grateful, right on top of the very ground my grandmother got dragged off of as a child. I didn't choose myself over a billionaire. That was never really the choice, was it? I chose myself over forgetting. I chose the woman with a name on a door over the woman who would have had everything except her own name. I chose the child at the low window over the foundation that would have taken the credit. I chose Ruth. And every single brick I lay now, every line I draw, every building people will one day walk through without ever knowing my whole story, every one of them has my grandmother's name somewhere in it. Carved in stone or just carried in me. Doesn't matter which. That's the only inheritance I ever needed. So if you've got a rooftop in your own life right now, somebody offering you everything beautiful, asking for just one small piece of yourself in return, just the part nobody would miss, just the name, just the door, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm just one woman who almost said yes. I'll only ask you the question my grandmother spent her whole life trying to teach me to ask. Can you leave the house they're building you? Because if you can't, baby, it was never yours to begin with.